Good evening. I'm Webster Tarpley, and I'm speaking to you from the Washington offices of the Tax Wall Street Party. We are now on the eve of the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary. These are political turning points that can mean a great deal to our country. So I'm coming to you tonight to talk about how you can intervene in this process through your caucusing, through your vote, to try to secure the best possible outcome. Obviously, the overall situation is grim. Not one of the existing candidates, not one of them is remotely qualified to be president. But nevertheless, what can you, as a thinking, intelligent, serious citizen, do to try to salvage what can be salvaged? So here are the indications that the Tax Wall Street Party would like to put out. These are our suggestions on how to salvage the best possible result. First, stop Trump. Defeat Trump. Trump needs to be humiliatingly defeated. This demagogue, this fascist, this proto-Hitler that we've got in the form of Trump has built his entire house on boasting, bragging, blustering, his invincibility, his invulnerability, and so forth, and how he always wins. Well, it's time for him to lose, and lose big. He needs to be humiliated. So therefore, any and all tactics that lead to the defeat of Trump in the Republican primary are absolutely in order at this time. They are actually an imperative moral duty for American citizens and voters. We'll get back to Trump in just a minute. The other side of our recommendation, we urge caucusers in Iowa and voters in New Hampshire to hold your nose and vote for Bernie Sanders. Yes, it has come to this. We are not doing this because Bernie is qualified to be president. He is not. And we're not doing it because we regard him as a person of presidential caliber, as a leader endowed with special courage or any similar moral superiority. He doesn't have any of that. But for structural reasons in the Democratic primary process, we want to keep that process going. We want to deny Hillary Clinton an early victory. We don't want the process to be shut down. We're stalling for time in the hope that other candidates may come into the race, which of course they can do in both parties. Because remember, the results of caucuses and primary elections, generally speaking, are binding on the first ballot of the convention. What happens if the convention goes to the second ballot? Why, then we have an open convention, a contested convention, and new candidates can come into the field. That is the desperate gamble that we must now undertake. A couple of points on the nature of this project of ours. First of all, we urge you to think about voting. It's not like getting married. It's not permanent. It is purely tactical. It is purely based on expediency. It does not commit you in the sense of principles, because as I've said, none of these candidates, not one of them, Republican or Democrat, is remotely qualified to be president. We've got to think about the entire political system of the United States. We've had, from 1968 to 2008, a reactionary period known as the Southern Strategy, with falling standards of living, useless foreign wars. We've had barbarism and culture and a general period of national decline. Now, since that period has ended in 2008, with Obama, we've sort of been in a gray area, suspended between catastrophe and mediocrity, and now that is also coming to an end. So it's important to see your intervention into this election process as something that has to do with changing the entire system. Don't worry about individuals, or better yet, worry about individuals only to the extent that they actually mediate changes. In other words, a Trump presidency would bring fascism to the United States. A victory by Hillary in the Democratic primary will essentially cut off the only, or the more likely, source of new candidates that might contribute something to the solution of the current crisis. So think about what it means for the entire political system. Now, for about 10 years, the Tax Wall Street Party, the United Front Against Austerity, the precursor organizations, myself personally, have advocated the following perspective. The Republican Party must cease to exist as a national political force. The Republican Party is a vehicle of reactionary and now fascist ideas, union busting, the immiseration of our national life, free trade, the giant sucking sound as jobs go overseas, plus that barbarism and national decline that everybody can witness to at this point. The Republican Party needs to become what it actually is. It is a party of racists, bigots, reactionaries, union busters, and so on down the line. Strong in the Deep South, unfortunately, in rural areas, and in the Intermountain West. It is a barbaric political formation, and it has skewed the American political debate so far to the right-wing reactionary direction that we are essentially a grotesque exception to the political developments in the rest of the world. We're becoming one of the most politically backward nations on earth, with all kinds of barbarism on display. So the Republican Party should no longer be able to contest the presidency, and their dominance in Congress should also be whittled away. The dominance in Congress is because of their gerrymandering, and even the existence, the contending power of the Republican Party is because of the big money, the Koch money, the Adelson money, the Mercer money, Mercer being the backer of Cruz at this point. So that Republican Party is actually a very artificial creation. It needs to disappear. It needs to become extinct. It needs to go the way of the Federalists, the Whigs, and the Know-Nothings. That is the imperative of this point. Now, at that time, we would then have the perspective of splitting the Democratic Party into two wings, which are more or less the wings that you see today. The Wall Street Democrats with Hillary Clinton, and the New Deal or pro-labor or progressive Democrats, the kind that have now attached themselves to Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is not a suitable leader, but since he's all there is, it has somehow transpired that many of these valuable people on the New Deal side of the Democratic Party have attached themselves to Bernie Sanders. So, again, we've got to get the best possible result out of that. Now, the Republican Party is indeed breaking up. In other words, the perspective that I and some others put forward 10 years ago, the Republican Party becomes extinct and the Democrats split into Wall Street and anti-Wall Street factions. That's what's happening. That prediction, that forecast was absolutely realistic. So if I brought you this far, stick with me now the rest of the way, because I can tell you what to do at this point. The Republican Party is breaking up. It's one of the most encouraging developments in a long time. It has not been advertised, although you've seen all the events, right? We've got reactionaries versus fascists. We've got Trump and Cruz fighting between themselves against the traditional reactionaries of the party, the Bushes, the Kasichs, the Christies, the Rubios, and all the rest. So there's one fault line. Then there's another fault line, the elite donor class, the billionaires, the politicized political billionaires, again, Koch, Adelson, Mercer, and the rest, against the base, against the crazed plebeian and petty bourgeois base of the Republican Party. In another way, you can say it's the enraged base who have become disaffected with the con men of yesterday, right, the Jeb Bushes or the Chris Christies, and are now looking for a new generation or a new echelon of con men in the form of Trump and Cruz. Look at what we see from day to day, right? Trump is feuding with the Fox News network. Great. South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley is attacking Trump Great. We've got the National Review, the Buckleyite reactionaries against Bob Dole, Orrin Hatch, John McCain, and others. And of course, much has to do with the fact that everybody hates Ted Cruz. Therefore, the breakup of the Republican Party is actually in sight. Now, if we had a real Democratic Party, they would be trying to accelerate and consummate this split of the Republican Party. We could say, I like the Republicans so much, I want there to be 2 or 3 or 4 Republican parties. That's the way we can get this solved. Now, the obvious interest attaches to Donald Trump, the real estate speculator who was put where he is by the Wall Street banks who threw money at him so that he could do real estate speculation with that money. Now let's look for a minute at Trump. I say fascist not simply as an epithet, but as a scientific term of classification. If you're talking about deporting 12 million Latinos, you are talking about one of the most ferocious police state dictatorships that has ever been imagined in the modern Western world. That's fascism right there. That's a police state. That's a dictatorship. And anybody who goes along with that and is concerned also with their own human rights, civil rights, is a fool. Because any attempt to do it is going to lead to a police state. At the same time, I would also point out, Trump depends on magical thinking, irrationalism. There will be no deportation of 12 million Latinos. This is physically impossible. We don't have the resources. Trump is lying through his teeth. However, he's playing on the hatred and the resentment of so many people who are now being duped again, duped before and duped again. The idea that you're going to keep all the Muslims out is also, it's an obscenity, it's also an impossibility. How are you going to find out who's a Muslim and who's not? We're going to have the Spanish Inquisition come in and decide? He wants to have a registry. Well, the registry is, of course, the tactic that was used in 1941 and 1942, right? You get a registry of all the Japanese in California, and then you put them in a concentration camp. I would also point out, that was not really the idea of Franklin D. Roosevelt. That was an idea of John J. McCloy. McCloy working for Stimson in the War Department, because McCloy had been an expert in sabotage, right? The Black Tom munitions plant in New York, the New York Harbor. That is essentially what Trump is trying to do, to go back to that. And don't blame it on FDR. Trump thinks that wages are too high. And you disgruntled Republicans are going to vote for him because he thinks wages are too high and that there should not be a federal minimum wage? Look at Trump's tax plan. The benefits are all concentrated in the top 0.2%. He wants to lower the top rate from 40 approximately to 25%. He wants to abolish the estate tax, which I call the oligarch tax, because it's going to be the last chance to claw back some of the ill-gotten wealth of the people who made out like bandits during the Reagan years. And the famous taxation of Wall Street proposed by Trump in terms of the carried interest provision for hedge fund hyenas, turns out that's about 2 or 3% increase. So Trump is giving billions once again and taking back a few 100,000 in many cases. Trump is a fascist. The essence of Trump's campaign is the triumph of the will. This was so associated with Hitler that they made a movie about it, the 1936 Olympics. But the triumph of the will in this case means Trump claims that he can do things nobody else can. Build a wall and make Mexico pay. That's not going to happen in the real world. But he's claiming that he can do it with his magical powers and the triumph of the will. This is pure demagogy, and it's also another example of magical thinking. Trump is essentially a tissue of fascist lies, bombast. In Europe, it's interesting, the European press is trying to present Trump as a buffoon, as a clown, someone who would never be president. And I've tried to counteract that to the best of my ability by telling the Europeans, look, Mussolini was once considered a clown. And somehow Mussolini got about 1 million people killed who would not have been killed if it hadn't been for his direct activity. So if he's a clown, the laughter is going to die away pretty soon, and we're going to have a terrible situation. Trump is, of course, in this wretched American tradition of the know-nothings, right? This party which arose and collapsed again during the 1850s. And if Trump can be a know-nothing, maybe we can see this is another way to get the Republican Party out of business in Washington, D.C. Obviously, Trump has the potential to be a wrecking ball for the Republican Party. We can also compare him, especially because of his hirsute, stylish hairdo. He's a little bit like Samson, right? Samson, who pulled down the columns in the Temple of the Philistines. Well, the Republicans certainly classify as Philistines in the cultural sense, so maybe that's what he's going to do. But the main thing about Trump is, don't laugh it off. Don't think that this is not serious. It's deadly serious because he could win. He could ride. The media are obviously sold out to Trump. All mass media do nothing but assist Trump in his demagogic campaign. Some people have been confused by the fact that Trump was flirting with Putin for a while. Putin's statements on this, I think, were regrettable, deplorable, ill-informed. We've tried to correct that mistaken impression that Trump has anything to do with good relations with Russia or anything of the kind. That is a throwaway line, and it seems to have been de-emphasized in recent weeks. In addition to the triumph of the will, we've also got the fact that Trump is a misogynist, not widely known in this country, but both Italian fascism and German Nazism were based on a revulsion against women, a hatred of women, a fear of feminine influence on any area of human life. So Trump fills the bill. He fulfills the fascist minimum, as scholars say, in a whole series of points. So don't trade in your old con for a new con in the form of Trump, right? Isn't it time to stop being a dupe if you're in the Republican base? Can't you see that the mass media are supporting him like nobody else? Now, let's look at Ted Cruz. Now, remember, one of the principles, one of the ways our world, human civilization, has survived is that evil often fights evil. And when evil can be made to fight evil, the good may benefit. Without that, I don't know if we would be here as human civilization in any sense of the term. Ted Cruz. What's Ted Cruz? Well, he's a demagogue, of course. He's an Elmer Gantry. He's a Bible-thumping hypocrite, a sallow-faced hypocrite, somebody who would go into the 8th circle of Dante's Inferno, down there among the fraudulent, because that's what he does. And he's a clerical fascist. Remember, there are different kinds of fascism. Trump seems to be the Mussolini or German type, but there are other kinds. There's Francisco Franco in Spain. There's Marshal Pétain in France. There's the Austrians, Dollfuss, and the Iron Guard in Romania with Codreanu. So Cruz is of that type. In other words, it's a kind of fascism that seems to be based on fanatical evangelical pastors who are not pastors but demagogues themselves, and a right-wing part, perhaps, of the Catholic hierarchy. That remains to be seen. This has been the stock in trade of people like Santorum in the past. The interesting thing about Trump is, generally speaking, he can't win the election because the appeal of that Elmer Gantry stuff is so narrow that it's unlikely that that could ever become hegemonic. But what he could do is defeat Trump in one place, and that's Iowa. And if Trump gets defeated in Iowa, the entire national situation will change for the better. So, if you're a Republican in Iowa, don't let Trump get through, because at that point he might become unstoppable, and then you'd have the descent into the abyss faster than you thought. Now, there are other people in the Republican Party, of course. We have other factions. We have the CIA Bush faction, the most hated dynasty in recent American history. I've devoted an entire book to George H.W. Bush, the unauthorized biography, and we got some stuff about Jeb in there. But the point is that the CIA Bush faction seems to be out of it. Although, of course, they've got those networks in Iowa and in New Hampshire, and surprises could be emerging. There are two governors who are running as strikebreaker-in-chief, or top scab. One would be Christie. This is the hardline strikebreaker, right? The guy who could go on television and try to shut down a strike wave, right, with threats. Then we have Kasich of Ohio, right? Somebody who got essentially beaten up thoroughly by the labor movement and has now realized that there's another way to do this, which is by evasion and stealth and misdirection. It's a kind of a soft line strikebreaker or soft line scab. Rubio, perhaps attempting to become the leader of the Miami Cuban community that was otherwise represented by Jeb. But forget all of them. They are, at this point at least, irrelevant. The main thing to do, and indeed, if you want to support one of those people, you've got to stop Trump, because otherwise it will be all over for those guys very soon. Now, the Democratic Party. We don't need to devote a lot of time to Hillary Clinton. She is a warmonger. She is a Wall Street puppet. We've now heard $600,000 from Goldman Sachs. Right? She's actually got something in common with Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz's wife works at Goldman Sachs, and that's where he gets his health care, and that's where he got $1 million to launch his Senate campaign. So can we believe a candidate like Cruz who says that he takes money from Goldman Sachs, but is nevertheless going to crack down on Wall Street? So that's absurd, and Hillary's premise that she can take $650,000 in direct payment from Goldman Sachs for her vapid speeches, completely filled with cliches and subterfuges, that's also not believable. And you can see again and again with Hillary that she is a warmonger. I'm afraid this has to do with her identity as a feminist politician. Hillary is convinced that unless she is the biggest warmonger in the room, unless she hears somebody saying, do conventional bombing, she's going to have to say, no, that's not good enough, do nuclear bombing, or things of this nature. Hillary Clinton is unfortunately convinced that unless she becomes the biggest warmonger in any consultation, she's going to be perceived as a weak, feckless woman. And this is, of course, the definition of weakness, that you feel an interior weakness and then you've got to somehow compensate for that by overdoing it. Right? It's usually seen in fatherless boys, but in this case, it's Hillary Clinton, the feminist. So this is a disaster. Now, she would like nothing better than to win in Iowa, win in New Hampshire, and then essentially put an end to the debate, close it all down. And this would be bad, because it would mean the Republican contest might go on, and the Democrats would essentially be through. And she has obviously schemed with her friends at the Democratic National Committee to prevent sufficient debates on the Democratic side. That has hurt the Democratic cause. So she will put anything, she'll put her own political success in front of any other values. Now let's look at Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is a weakling, and we've seen it again and again. This is really a problem if you want to be president, because the world is not made up of philanthropic entities, unfortunately, but some very ugly and very capable opponents. Right? And it's useless to tell yourself that this does not exist. Why issue an engraved invitation to them? Now, we're calling on people to hold their nose and vote for Bernie, once again, not because we think he should be president, not because we think he will be, but to keep the process open. We're interested in an open convention. We'll talk a bit about this in a second. Bernie's not qualified. Bernie is not a leader. But here's what he does do. He recites a catalog, a litany of real issues. He talks about the fact that free trade is a failure, that there's income inequality, that the minimum wage has to be increased, that there ought to be paid family and parental leave. All real issues. The problem with Bernie is the fuzziness. Where's the beef was the word some cycles ago. With Bernie, it's where's the beef? Where are the detailed, programmatic solutions to the problems of the American people? Where's your job creation program, Bernie? He says he wants to have $1 trillion spent on infrastructure, and that would be 13 million jobs. The problem with that is, if you do the arithmetic, that would mean that the wages and benefits of those jobs would be low, and the capital investment would be practically non-existent. The Tax Wall Street Party demands $5 trillion from the Federal Reserve, 0% interest over 100 years, which gives you a much, much better mix of wages, benefits, and capital investment per job. Capital investment per job for Bernie doesn't exist. And of course, as always, Bernie never touches the Federal Reserve System. He never mentions it. He never laid a glove on Bernanke or Yellen or the meddlers and bunglers at the Federal Reserve, who by raising interest rates last December have now pitched the U.S. economy into a tailspin, right? Some of you have lost about 10% off your Wall Street accounts. Well, that's just for openers. So Bernie needs to address that. Bernie, if you don't like free trade sellouts, if you don't like the giant sucking sound, you've got to advocate a protective tariff of 15%, and so on down the line. A lot of the reforms that we need have got to be paid for by a Wall Street sales tax of 1% on all turnover. That is to say, stocks, bonds, and derivatives. Bernie, at least in his public statements during the debates, is extremely vague. He says he wants a transaction tax on Wall Street, which would then pay for free college for everybody in community colleges and in state institutions. That's great. But again, where's the beef? What's the percentage? What's going to get taxed? Where will the money go? Will there be revenue sharing? We need detailed answers to fight demagogy coming from all of the billionaire-funded candidates. So we could go through any number of other points, but the basic pattern is simply there. Bernie succeeds in naming real issues, but his solutions are poor. The job program is no good. There's no teeth in the protectionism, right? He doesn't really advocate protectionism, and so on down the line. There's also one very worrying thing about Bernie, which is he's seemingly in love with the reactionary Dark Ages monarchies of the Middle East. He seems to be in love with Saudi Arabia and with Jordan and with Qatar and with the United Arab Emirates, and he wants them to police the Middle East. What kind of program is that? That a Dark Ages monstrosity like Saudi Arabia should somehow solve the problem in Syria? The Saudis are the source of the problem. Remember that the Saudi Arabian monarchy that Bernie admires so much, the Saudi monarchy is the biggest funder of terrorism in the world. Not Iran, but Saudi Arabia. So what do we hope to do? We want to extend the process. Hillary wants to cut off debate. We want to keep debate open. You can do that by holding your nose and voting for Bernie. We want to have an open convention. This slogan has not been raised in years, but it's a very good one. A convention can be real. There's no reason for a convention to be a vapid, stupid, banal photo opportunity like an infomercial. It should be a real political fight, and it can be that. Stop Hillary. Right? We don't want Hillary so close to the presidency because she is not qualified. She is a failure. And once again, remember, once we get to the second ballot, the sky's the limit. We can do anything becomes possible. Dark horse candidates, stalking horse candidates, all kinds of intrigues, smoke-filled rooms even, and undoubtedly will be there. But out of that might come new candidates. There might be other politicians who are more viable than the ones that we see. In other words, maybe Hillary will be swept aside, Bernie will be swept aside. I'd like to add that if you want to prevent Hillary from picking up all the marbles and taking her dollies and go home. There is, of course, Governor O'Malley, right? Maybe you feel strongly about the death penalty. Well, Governor O'Malley abolished the death penalty in Maryland. That's got to be worth something. He also enacted the DREAM Act, right, for the young immigrants who need to go to college at in-state rates. And marriage equality, something that really the Union Army brought to the entire country in the form of the 14th Amendment, meaning that we have the equal protection of the laws. It's an open and shut case. So that brings us to our conclusion once again. You've got to stop Trump. People who lived through the fascist era always said, if only they had been nipped in the bud, if only they had been stopped right away and crushed, then the Hitler people and the Mussolini people might not have been able to seize power. As of today, a leading talk show host who is associated most intimately with the Trump campaign is telling us that the Bundy gang in Oregon, the ones who have now been finally rounded up, and one of them got himself killed by charging the federal and state officials, officers, with a gun in his hand. He was killed. This is regrettable, but what in God's name could such people have expected with that kind of conduct? The interesting thing is that this well-known talk show host, ranking 4th or 5th in the country, or maybe better, has been saying now that he thinks that those are heroes and he's going to start a legal defense fund. So here's the other element, right? At Trump's rallies, we have people who get beat up all the time. His goons beat you. You're black, they beat you. You're Hispanic, they beat you. You're a Muslim, they beat you up for that. They throw you out. It was always clear that that gang of armed thugs taking over that federal facility in Oregon would gravitate towards one of the two fascist alternatives. And now it looks like they're gravitating towards Trump. So that is a very, very serious matter. Remember, the essence of fascism is a terrorist dictatorship of the banks under color of law, if they can, but the presence of armed gangs, absolutely critical. So we have to have zero tolerance for armed gangs. The whole history of Italian and German fascism and Nazism point us in this direction. So that's one side. On the Cruz side, you've also got people who are violent. He's got in his campaign organization and his campaign committee, he's got groups that incite, through whatever means, directly or indirectly, violence against physicians, medical doctors, who provide reproductive health services to women, especially poor women, in these famous Planned Parenthood clinics. And everybody knows the monstrous homicides and violence that have been visited on these so-called abortion doctors. So between the two fascist candidates in the Republican Party, you've got that essential quality, feature, to meet the fascist minimum, you got to have armed gangs. And they do. That has been hidden, and it hopefully will come out more and more. But the violence at the rallies, the Bundy gang now gravitating towards Trump, or maybe some of them. Some of them undoubtedly will gravitate towards Cruz. But that's the situation. So, stop Trump. Cruz, of course, if Cruz wins, he will be crowing, but he will then be going on to New Hampshire and will presumably be beaten up in some of these places by the capable machine of Trump. So that's the best we can do on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, hold your nose and vote for Bernie Sanders for all the structural reasons that I've tried to outline. That's the way to keep the door open to some better result, which we cannot predict today, but which could indeed be forthcoming. Don't let Hillary Clinton cut off the debate. And we urge those who are interested in this at home and abroad, follow all of these developments at the Tax Wall Street Party website, TWSP.us. You can also find it at my own website, Tarpley.net. We issue a daily briefing. You can subscribe to that for free. We will soon be launching a daily television program about these events. Keep your eyes peeled for that. And we thank you for your attention. And remember, stop Trump and stop Hillary by holding your nose and voting for Bernie Sanders. This has been Webster Tarpley here from the Tax Wall Street Party in Washington.